No quorum yet. No. Megan's out there talking. We don't have a quorum.
We do.
We don't.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 7's a quorum.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. All right, we're getting started. Welcome to the budget work session. We have Susan and Kristen here today. The objective is to share some updated numbers with us and to clear up any confusion we have about what our gap is that we're currently facing. There shouldn't be a lot of discussion, but I'll ask you to hold your questions until the end of their presentation so we can make up some time here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As the board already knows, the county executive released the county's advertised budget on February 17th. And just to highlight a few points, the recommended transfer increase to FCPS for school operations was $56.65 million, which is 3.2%. That was the 3% guidance plus the 0.2% for full-day Mondays. In addition to that, there's funding for debt service of $10.2 million. Based on that recommendation, that does leave a gap of $14 million between the school system's advertised budget request and the county executive's advertised budget. In addition to that operating gap, as you guys noted this morning in your earlier work session, there is the gap of $13.1 million from the Infrastructure Financing Committee recommendations that were approved by both boards, and the county board did take action on that recommendation on April 22nd, 2014. Included in the county executive's advertised budget was a recommended tax rate of 1.09 per $100. That's the same tax rate for property taxes currently in place, and that was advertised by the county board. That does result in an increase to the typical county household of $185. When we look at the county's advertised budget, just some of the other highlights, they did include compensation increases for their employees. They included performance and longevity increases, as well as a market rate adjustment, which is similar to our market scale adjustment, and that was 0.84%. So combined, they included a 3.3% increase for county employees in terms of salaries. When you look at the county executive's budget, the other thing to note is they are opening a second SAC room at Terracet Elementary School. They're also opening a new SAC room at the Providence Community Center. In addition to that, the county did have a few budget reductions that will likely impact FCPS. So I just wanted to point out the one that some of you have already heard about, or they want to eliminate the 3 computer learning centers located at school sites. So in case that's something that you weren't aware of, I did want to point that out. That includes Annandale Terrace, Mount Vernon Woods, and there was also one at Hybela Valley, but it's currently closed. It was closed in the 2012-2013 academic year due to limitations on program space. So I just wanted to point that out. In addition, the county also, when they brought up their advertised budget, mentioned the B-Pole business professional and occupational license impact. The county does have funding set aside to help them mitigate that impact. They had funding previously set aside and then added some at third quarter. So when we look at the county budget, again, that left a $14 million gap in terms of our operating funds. Next, when we think of the state, when the General Assembly adopted their budget on February 27th, it did include some additional revenue as compared to the projections in FCPS's advertised budget. So there's a $4.7 million increase in revenue for a compensation supplement. That was contingent upon the state meeting their revenue forecasts, which we'll know after their year end. That would require FCPS to provide a minimum average increase of 1.5% to all of our employees. So we do believe that the current salary increases in the advertised budget would meet that requirement. In addition...
But keep in mind, our budget's good portion of our budget is the salary increases. So if we have to mitigate at some point because they refuse to fund our full ask, we would have to be very careful not to the incentive, assuming it's funded, could be compromised if we don't get to that level. If I may, you might want to elaborate on what I just said if that's not clear, Kristen.
No, you're absolutely clear. And on a point I was going to make, when we look at the shortfall at the end, we need to be very clear if when we're balancing this budget, if we reduce compensation and can't meet the minimum level required by the state, that would reduce our state revenue by $4.7 million. Right, and that's the minimum level required. Correct. So moving on to the state, when the state adopted the budget, they did adopt a Virginia retirement system rate that was 14.06%, and that impacts FCPS both in terms of revenue and expenditures. So because we receive funding based on our SOQ, or Standards of Quality Funded Positions, that results in a revenue decrease of $0.8 million when combined with the state basic aid offset. Then on the expenditure side, it results in a $6 million decrease in expenditures, right? So those are all of the state revenue items combined. So lastly, when we look at FCPS's budget, we really need to think about our additional considerations and unknowns. So every year in the spring, we recalculate our enrollment projections, and those enrollment projections are what are used to staff the schools in the fall. So remember, when we build our proposed budget in the fall, we're really using estimates from the previous year's CIP, right? And they haven't been influenced yet by our actual enrollment experience in this current school year, right? So every spring, we completely recalculate enrollment projections for every program, for every school, by every individual student service category, right? And every year, we pick up those enrollment projections as part of the approved budget adoption. And each year that amount has varied, right? If we look back just over the last 7 years, right, it's been from as much of a decrease as $6.3 million to as much of an increase as $10.6 million. So when we look at right now, where we're at right now, we've recalculated our special ed enrollment cost for the spring, and we know that's going to have an increased cost of $4 million. But we're not done calculating all of our other enrollment staffing and calculation costs. So we still need to factor in general education, advanced academics, and English for speakers of other languages. So in the presentation that we shared with the Board of Supervisors, where we had that $4 million cost that we said was spring enrollment projections to date, that was only the special ed component, right? So we still need to complete those others and update that cost.
You remember in the original budget, the advertised budget, we had student enrollment and demographic increases of $18.6 million. You remember at that time we were already experiencing some new phenomenon in terms of increases to the demands and services. For an example, you remember that I spoke specifically about, at that time, we had already experienced a huge increase in level 1 students in ESOL. And so we actually added into the projections around student enrollment and demographic changes of an additional $4 million just for that purpose. But that's a guess at that point in December. It's a guess based on the fall. And we're continuing to see huge numbers of increases. And so it's an evolving process, and maybe at a point in time when we had budgets, we had a little bit more fluidity in our budget. Now we're so tight. That's when these changes like this, of this magnitude, it gets to have a major impact on the budget itself.
And then the only other piece I just want to kind of point out is Kristen mentioned the changes in the state. You'll notice that our numbers are slightly different from what we presented in February 27th at the Board of Supervisors, because we're learning new information. As new information comes forward, we recalculate where we are as of today. And this is one of the reasons why we try to not to say we have a new gap or today's gap or tomorrow's gap. Our gap from the advertised budget is $14 million, and we have some new information since the advertised budget.
And the advertised budget is what this board voted on. And so, as far as I'm concerned, that's the delta that they have to take into consideration, is that difference between our ask of them and what monies we have available.
Because that $8.1 million is $600,000 going not the direction we wanted to go from February 27th number. So as we redid all of the state aid numbers, it is now 8.1 as of today rather than 7.5 that we had late February. So that's why that number is very fluid.
That was the exact last thing I was going to do was go through the chart and say why the numbers had changed. So
Okay.
Any questions?
That was concise. That was wonderful. Thank you. All right. So we'll start with Mr. Moon and then Ms. Derenak Koufax.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I do have a couple of questions to ask. Earlier during the facilities work session, board members talked about a county executive not putting in $13.1 million. The board of supervisors agreed to put in to give us as additional CIP funding, capital funding, that in order, and I, including myself, we expressed our dismay and disappointment, great disappointment in county executive failure to do that. In order for the board of supervisors to give us that agreed upon additional funding of $13.1 million capital funding, how much of a debt service payment is required for the next year? I think that was one of the budget questions, but if you could let us know for public, is it 1.2?
I believe it was 1.2 million is what we
So
got
as
back
far as
from the
board of
county.
supervisors, for them to be able to fund us that, it's not that they have to put in $13.1 million out of their operating budget, but it is only $1.2 million as a debt service.
Correct. If they issued $13 million in additional
Bond
debt.
capacity. So it
Capacity.
only requires $1.2 million of debt service payment. I
Correct.
think we all need to understand that correctly.
And Kathy Smith did ask a budget question where they provided
Yeah,
that information.
Kathy wanted to
I
just
just wanted to read it because they did. This was the question I asked at the end of the joint meeting. So the question is, what is the possibility of a one-time increase of the $155 million yearly cap on school bond sales for capital improvement projects by $13.1 million? Here's their answer, because it doesn't talk about the possibility. It just said, if the county were to provide a one-time amount of, and they underlined one time, of $13.1 million of general obligation bond sales for the schools, this would increase the county's debt ratio by 0.03% and would require approximately $1.2 million in additional debt service annually beginning in FY 216. And when they say annually, that's over the 25 years of the bond?
That would be my assumption, that it's
But they
over a
didn't.
20-year bond, but they didn't state that. So until we could confirm the numbers, that's what we have.
Okay, that was my first question and sort of statement I wanted to make to public. A second is a really question. That has to do with, what did I put down? Okay, special education update, enrollment update as of, I don't know what the date is. Could you correct me if I'm wrong? This one update is compared to what we projected at the beginning of this school year for this particular school year, correct?
Correct. So
Correct.
Correct.
So let me do this. When you put it the additional $4 million, this one, it looks as if this is going into the base for the next fiscal year's budget. Then, am I not correct in saying that then this update should be the update of our projected numbers as of today for the number for the next year as opposed to September 30th of this year, this school year? Do you understand what I'm saying? Because if this is just compared to the number as projected when we approved the budget last year, then this should be a one-time funding as opposed to ongoing recurring cost.
Sure. So let me I'll explain, I think. When we develop our proposed budget, right, that Dr. Garza presents in January, right, we really have to start calculating that projected cost of enrollment growth for the next school year soon, usually September, before we even have September 30th actual membership counts. So we project how many students we think we'll have in every program, in this case special education, for the next school year. Then we start this current school year and enrollment comes in, right? And in cases where more students come than we projected, in the current school year, we use the staffing reserve to meet those staffing requirements. So then as we move through and we know how many students are enrolled in our special education programs this year, then in the spring, when we start to recalculate our enrollment for the next fall, we actually start by looking at our enrollment as of February. So we now know how many new students we gained this year, and then we're updating our projection for next fall. So if we were to look at the cost of enrollment growth, what we're really going to have to do is take that $18.6 million in the proposed budget. We're going to have to add this $4 million for special education. We'll have to make the change for general education, advanced academics, and ESOL, and all of that together as compared to the prior year will be the cost of enrollment growth.
So could I say that this additional cost, the comparison between this number, updated number, versus what we projected when you adopted this year, FY15's budget, and is the same as that comparison between this updated number with enrollment projected for the next year when we approved advertised budget earlier in February. So am I probably not making myself clear to you? No. Okay.
When you adopted the advertised budget, those were projected enrollment that we did back in October, November timeframe that we are projecting for 16 based on what information was available at that time. And sometimes all your special education information isn't available yet. So when we try to project out the enrollment now, we have more up-to-date information. So we revise our projections for next school year. So as Kristen mentioned, back in October, November timeframe for Dr. Garza's proposed budget, we thought special education would be this number. Well, now we have more up-to-date information that says we're requiring more intensive services for some of our special education students. Now we have to add that into our base for next year because in this current year, we did absorb some of that through staffing reserve. So when our projections are off in any given year, we typically use staffing reserve to mitigate it for that current year. And then it's increased into base for next year so that then staffing reserve next year can be used for any enrollment projections or challenges we have for that particular school year.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Derenak-Kofax, followed by Mrs. Strauss.
I have a follow. Well, my question was like Ilyan's, but maybe I'm going to ask it a little bit different way because I've been getting some pushback from some of the supervisors that I'm meeting with. Have we done this before? Have we changed the projections on enrollment? Because
Yes, and in fact, I mentioned it at the meeting itself. I said
Okay.
the last time there were substantial variations where it would necessitated saying this is happening was in 2010. We actually lowered it because of we lowered the ask because of enrollment did not seem to be tracking the amount we had expected on the
Correct.
Is that correct?
The other thing to remember this year when we met with the Board of Supervisors is the timing of that joint meeting changed. Right, this year we met earlier than we did. Typically, we used to
Okay.
always meet, mid-March, a little bit later in March, and this time we met about 3 weeks early in February. So some of that timing impacts, but every single year, looking back, we have an adjustment on our approved agenda, which shows the enrollment and student demographic updates from the spring.
And sometimes that everyone wants you to be transparent, but if you're transparent, then they start to say you're
If
doing something wrong.
If you're too transparent,
Right,
they tell
and-
you
and this
you're trying.
Yeah, this has
not-
happened every year. We develop a budget. It's based upon a projection, and as we work through the year, we know more and more and more about what we're experiencing to get a better prediction or a closer prediction of what's really going to happen when we start school in September.
And I guess when you talk special education, tell me specifically the cohort you're talking about. Are you talking about any changes to the ESOL programming in there?
No, when we're talking about special education,
You're-
we're talking about students that are receiving any type of special education service, and it would be all services that are factored into that projection. So Category A, Category B, Level 1, Level 2. We actually go back and project again for every single student and every single service at every single location, right? So the other important thing to remember is sometimes when projections change, it doesn't necessarily translate into a change in staffing. Right? So if you have space in that classroom and we're projecting another student, it may not trigger the next teacher. But if you're at the enrollment capacity for that special education service, for example, and then we project 1 or 2 additional students, it's going to require another teacher or an instructional assistant. PAC is a perfect example. Preschool autism, for example. Those
Okay.
have really firm class sizes. So once they've reached the maximum of that class size, any additional students will automatically generate additional staff.
Okay, I'd like to just go offline with you to talk specific numbers. We've talked about that. Thank you.
Okay, I have Mrs. Strauss, followed by Mr. Velkoff, Mrs. Smith, and Mrs. Schultz.
Just for sorry, I always find it's very difficult to help people understand the difference between what we staff in August, September, and the fact that we have to have a staffing reserve category and how that is used. In the mid-'90s, we had to go into that $8 million reserve and take $5 million to cover enrollment growth that was present in February. I remember that was very disconcerting.
And we completely exhausted the staffing reserve this year.
That's what I was going to
completely,
ask.
completely
Oh my
gone. It's been
God.
gone for some time, and we've just had to, where we've had schools that have had
Oh, you're
positions
kidding.
not filled, we've had to work with them, and they've given up positions to, so we've had to make it work this year, not to have to go to
Wow.
emergency reserve.
When did we exhaust the reserve? That was one of my questions.
January, December, January, and it's largely because of these huge increases in specialized programming.
That's frightening. That. Oh my, that's disconcerting. That's too bad. Oh dear. Thank you.
Mr. Velkoff.
So I have a question and a comment. So, and of course, it's about the $4 million for special education. So I heard the verbal description of a range of things that have happened over the past, in just the past 3 years, and maybe this is something you need to get back to us, but where would I find that historical information? Does it show up in the proposed approved budget? Is it third quarter review? So
So you're going to see it in 2 places. It's always included on the approved budget agenda for information. When we separate out even the required from the recommended, it's a required adjustment. So that's the easiest place to find it, right? It does get included in the approved budget book, but the agenda's a very clear place to find it.
okay, so because another experience I had this weekend was, this time it was a member of the General Assembly who brought the presentation from February 27th and showed it to me and said, look, we just found you $10.5 million at the state, and now here you go again, asking for another $4 million, right? So we really just have to keep educating these folks. We're being transparent, right? You would normally not have seen this information until May, and we're trying to get it out there so you know right now, as soon as we know it, what our needs are going to be. So I think there's just a lot of communication
Yeah.
that we have to do when we talk to these folks.
And Mr. Velkoff, we could go back to the way we've done things in the past and ask for an 8% increase to the transfer, and maybe we would have gotten 4% increase to the transfer, and then we wouldn't be having this conversation. But we put forward a tight budget, and so this is what happens,
That's, yeah.
right? So maybe next year, foolish. I guess I was foolish. So maybe next year we'll go and ask for, actually next we will be anyway, asking, maybe we'll go for 12% increase to the transfer next year.
Mrs. Smith.
So I want to come back to the $13.1 million gap on the CIP side. So the reality comes down to a discussion of the revenue that the supervisors have to use to fund other things. Do we know at this point how much revenue that they have? There was a small amount I thought that they had that they could still place on stuff, whether it was $4 or $6 million. Do we know what that amount is?
Yeah, they had just over $3 million available when they did their FY15 advertised budget. And then they also said based on the state budget impact to the county, there was an additional 2.7. So at that point, that was their available funding.
So,
About 5.7.
so the reality is there's no way they're going to fund the 13.1 to the construction fund. So the next point, right, then you're talking about them just needing the $1.2 million to set aside for the debt service. I would take from reading this, even though they didn't say it, that increasing the debt ratio by 0.03% is still going to keep them well within their 10% cap and not move that very much. So really, any advocacy that we could do has to happen before they vote on their budget. I don't hope that we have much success, but the only way I can see for us to get that revenue is to make the focus on increasing the cap for 1 year.
Without risk of, I just want to make sure everyone's clear on what you're talking about, Ms. Smith, about the differences, because I think it's really important. What is the difference between the 13.1 million that was promised before and what you're suggesting? They're two very different, and I think it's important for board members to completely understand what you're talking about. So if no one does, we may need to spend a few minutes describing the difference.
So when we originally started the Infrastructure Financing Committee, it was because the board wanted to increase the $155 million cash flow a year by $25 million. That was not acceptable to the Board of Supervisors because they are concerned, and I think we are. We want to keep the AAA bond rating. We don't want to lose that. So that's when John Cook came up with the idea that, well, if we give you $13.1 million to the construction fund, you can then fund your roofs and some of those long-term items that we bonded outside of that. So that's what freed up the $13.1 million in the cash flow so that we were able to move projects along. And on a good faith effort, that's how our CIP was developed.
So can I restate that?
Yes.
And then I like your description, and then you can go to the next part. And so what the conversation was around, those things with very short life cycles or shorter life cycles, to not bond those, right, to start paying for those out of annual operating budgets, recognizing we don't have the money to do that. So that's why they said pull 13.1 million out of your the bonding cap funds, and put it into operation and pay for it using operational money. Okay. But since they're not doing that, and we've done that, we've now planned around that. So now we don't have that money. So Ms. Smith then, in an alternative mode, is suggesting that they now go back to capital money.
So that way we don't have to change the way we've done the cash flow in our CIP. And, you know, I think we would all prefer for where we are behind that we could get a permanent change. My advocacy was for a 1-year change. You know, this doesn't get into any of those details of whether they would do it or not. I think their default would be not to do it, but I don't think that doesn't mean we shouldn't advocate.
They also have done this before. We were short in terms of our obligation around the Fort Belvoir Elementary School and what we had to provide in terms of in-kind monies, and so they agreed to, for one time, to allocate an additional $5 million in our appropriation, and then that became part of their debt service, and so they did that this past year for us. So this would not be this would be in keeping with what they've done before to help us get by, because otherwise we're going to have a deficit now also on our capital budget.
So I guess then the follow-up question is, how do we deal with this with the supervisors? And if we're in agreement that this is the way we should make up that difference, is it a letter from the chairman to their board saying that we would want their consideration of this? Because I think we need to do something about this rather than just let it slide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Finished? Yes? Okay.
If everyone agrees, we can begin crafting a letter from the...
Okay, just by show of hands, can I see if board members would agree?
Yeah, could we wait a
Okay,
bit?
you want to wait? Okay. Okay, all right, that's a potential next step. We'll revisit. Good idea. Okay, Mrs. Schultz, followed by Ms. McLaughlin.
Okay, so in that vein, I'm hoping that we can have the discussion and use the highlights. And I know Mr. Plattenberg's not here, but Ms. Quinn and Ms. Michael, you may have it's late, and I've only had one sip of afternoon coffee. The notion around the millions of square feet that the Board of Supervisors manage versus what we manage, and the body impact of 25,000 employees in our buildings, 186,000 students, and we don't talk about this, the year-round community use aspect. So the seven, it's, as I understand, it's about a 7 of the total 2.6 million square feet. So that has got to be a part of the conversation. And if it's only, as Ms. Smith said, if it's only a 1 year because of the 13.1 million issue, if it's only a 1 year solution for this year, fine, but it also begins the conversation as a strategic conversation going forward. Because there's no way that we can continue, even if we accept the Standard & Poor's and other reviews, that we've got to maintain the 10%, we've got to close the gap on the funding, and that we don't carry the debt service too high to imperil our AAA bond rating. The inherent problem is the division of the existing capital monies. Whether they raise it or not is a separate issue. It's with the existing funds that are available. There is a gross disparity in the proportional division of those funds. So I think that if we're going to have a letter, that has got to be emphasized, and that's got to become part of our kind of colloquial talk about this, as we go forward into the community. The second part is on, and I've noticed a lot of my colleagues have talked about the 4.0 on special education. On the division, Ms. Michael, between general education, AAP, ESOL, and special ed, the special ed line is just for services. The general education line would be the what? The $12,000 or $13,000 figure per student for the additional students? Is that the...
It's going to be the actual enrollment. So what we're doing is we're going back, again, we have new projections, school by school, student by student. So the general education number is going to pick up that change in enrollment.
Does that include a calculation of FRM status at 1.5 times?
It's going to include the impact of needs-based staffing. The impact of needs-based staffing is going to vary depending on the school's poverty rate and number of students.
But on which line item would that fall? Would that fall on general education? Would that fall on ESOL?
It's going to be in the general education number.
Okay. So
but you have to remember, even with general education, we could say spring projections are going to come in 400 more students than what we projected in the fall. But that doesn't always translate to additional resources. It's just where those kids are projected to come in.
Right, that's why I'm asking
so we don't just multiply
where the needs-based staffing formula falls. And if that 1.5 times falls on that general ed line, the question is, are we showing what the FRM projection versus general versus not, since it all falls on the same line, are we showing what our FRM projected 1.5 times calculation was versus actual?
So when we calculate the general education number on this chart, we currently don't separate out the impact of the needs-based staffing in that calculation because we would have to do that calculation twice, right? Both with the FRM included and it not included based on the way our formulas work. And due to the timing, remember this year we're working really hard to accelerate hiring. So we moved all of our staffing deadlines up. So we're going to get the enrollment projections and just get them calculated in order to get them to schools to accelerate hiring. So we typically don't. Where you're going to see the impact of that FRM or needs-based staffing is in our program budget. So every fall when we calculate the program budget, you'll see exactly what that impact is.
I don't know that
total.
I buy that explanation because we know what our FRM numbers are. We know what we projected, and you know what you hold as that needs-based staffing figure.
Again,
and so
we'd have to go back and calculate it school by school by school because, again, that change in FRM may or may not trigger an additional teacher or may not result in the loss of a teacher, right? So we'd have to, it's timing is why we can't do it now.
Let me say that another way. If we use division-wide percentages, which is the only thing we can really do in a lot of ways, you don't tease it out enough. Schools that don't have, they have to have 20% free and reduced lunch before they even start to qualify for needs-based staffing. So that's why you have to look at it from a school-by-school level.
But if we're able to update our special education numbers,
I think it comes down to having the time to be able to calculate that difference at this point, right?
I have a feeling that this is where we're going to fall in the crosshairs.
No, we know where our enrollment cost will be for next year, right?
No,
So-
what I'm saying is I think that this is where we're going to fall in the crosshairs with our colleagues on the Board of Supervisors. They're going to say, you've overprojected your FRM status, you have plenty of money. So I think that unless we show where our general ed non-FRM, we don't use that phrase, but unless we show what our FRM projections were and what they actually are,
So
they're gonna tease out that there's more money there than there is unless we show that it's not there.
So with free and reduced price meals, that is the one place where it's not a projection. We use the actual numbers from VDOE from the prior October 31st.
I
So
understand.
it's-
That's why I'm saying I don't understand why it's not here, because you don't have to recalculate anything. We can use the numbers from October 31st.
From last year.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a percentage of the student population.
We'd have to recalculate every school individually. You will see any change to needs-based staffing overall in the program budget, because at that point we'll have the time to go back and calculate to basically pull apart the impact of FRM from all of the other student enrollment counts.
Okay.
But our ability to do that after the budget talk doesn't do us any good, because we're going to walk into a budget discussion where they're going to say, you projected X FRM students at 1.5 times. You had something less than X, therefore you have more money. And if we don't have the answer of that walking into this discussion, then we're left without the information to counter any argument. So I think it's a lot better if we, and it may be difficult, it may be time consuming, but if we don't have an answer if we don't have the answer.
I have Ms. Smith, a quick go back or related to this?
Related to
particular-
this, because I think there's two different things that we're talking about here. One thing is knowing the number of free and reduced kids. The other thing is where they are and the impact in the staffing of the schools and what that costs us. I mean, are we talking about two separate things here, is my impression? Or is it just the timing to get it done, actually?
I actually don't think we're vulnerable to criticism about over-projecting FRM because they're actuals. It's not a projection. So we don't project what percentage of FRM we're going to have at each school, and then it is or is something different.
But we project
because we use
needs-based
the
staffing.
actual.
We project the needs-based staffing is the 1.5 times calculation. And so, and we don't do that based on actual, we do that based on projections.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure where 1.5 times comes in because this is all weighted. I think what we're saying is for the percentage that would qualify for needs-based staffing, it's an actual percentage that we submitted to Virginia Department of Education for last year. We don't project where we're going to be in free and reduced percentage. And then you take the total enrollment, okay? So total projected enrollment, let's say we have 1,000 students. That school happens to have a 20% FRM ratio from last year.
But I'm not talking about money from the state. I'm talking about
no,
the
this isn't-
needs-based.
Okay, folks, you know what? It's a discussion that I'm going to table for now. I've got it here, and perhaps it could be either taken offline or staff can follow up and try to explain it later. I think we all understand what you're saying, but it seems like in the explanation we're starting to eat up time, and I'm not sure that it's beneficial. So I want to suggest that we move on, and I'm going to go to Ms. McLaughlin.
Before I say anything, Dr. Garza, did you want to try to clarify something?
Well, I was going to ask if this is correct, Kristen. Do you agree with this? We're not as vulnerable with general education or really advanced academics. Those, we know what our trend is. We can follow the trend. We can project, I think, to a reasonable extent based upon experience. I think what's most pronounced this year for us is the intensity of the services that we're seeing with the students that we're growing with. And that's particularly pronounced in the area of special education, our most expensive programming, special education, and ESOL Level 1 students. That's where, and we can guess all the rest, and we do, I think, a pretty good job of projecting all the rest based upon our experience factor. I think the experience factor this year has been unique in those two programs, and I think principals can tell you that that's what they're seeing too. Do you agree with that statement or not?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, very good. Ms. McLaughlin?
Yeah, to the two issues I think I'm hearing us wrestle with. The first one, this notion about, Ms. Derenak-Kofax, I think you referenced it, the $4 million change in special education assessment, and the concern that the board of supervisors are going to have some pushback on it. And what came to mind for me is the importance of showing your homework. I mean, as we're trying to continue building our credibility and cultivate support from the board of supervisors, I think this is one of those instances where, providing them with more information maybe enables them to understand how we got to our answer. That they can, and I even feel like as a board member, I can defend something better if I see how you got to your answer. So for that line item, if $4 million is changed, I'm not saying you have to go all the way down to the granular level, but it wouldn't hurt to have a little bit of some sort of summary that says, why does that $4 million suddenly appear? What's different? I mean, that's a way that we enlist their support. And I heard Supervisor Faust saying that at the end of our joint meeting, when we talked about next year's projected budget needs. And he said, if you're telling us you need 7 to 8% for next year, increase in your transfer, and we're telling you don't think you're going to see more than 4, then we need you to start showing us your homework now in terms of what's behind that. And I know you guys will, but I'm just...
No, we did.
Well, then I think that they're saying then is there's not enough information then that helps them. Like, in other words, there's a 100,000 foot response, and maybe they want us to take it down to the next one in terms of what we're talking about. But I still will say that with a change in the special education, it's hard to refute facts. So if Ms. Kofax, if I heard you correctly, that the concern is that they're going to say, well, isn't this convenient that you suddenly, had some additional state revenue comes in, but the ask is still elevated up again because you need $4 million for special education. So how did that materialize? And so my point would be to say, to show them what exactly are we talking about here?
And the ask did not change. The ask stayed the same. I think the challenge we have is we did show our work. Maybe they don't pay attention to the materials we provide, and that's unfortunate. But, and there's certain people, I think, that want to create conditions so they can say no and make their work easier. This is not easy work. With regard to special education and ESOL, whatever programming is happening right now in terms of what students are needing, we're obligated by law to provide it. So at the end of the day, those are going to be required increases, and we're going to find ourselves in a vice where we won't be able to do what we need to do on compensation for our employees because that it can't give in this area. Do you see what I'm saying? So we have to find other places where we can actually have some flexibility, and unfortunately, that's in compensation. And so that's the kind of reality of it, is if they can't help us fund these required increases for students and required programming, then we're going to be unable to fund our employee increases.
But I would say, Dr.
I get the show the work thing, though. I think there's more we can give on that.
But I want to make sure I'm understanding what up here correctly. Yes, we asked for, what we asked for created a $14 million shortfall. But then, as I understand the update that we're talking about here today, is that we had a change in state revenue, but then we also had a change in our enrollment updates. So even though it's not like we're suddenly coming back and saying, oh, we've changed it, now we actually need you to give us $16 million. So they're going to say, okay, we see that you got additional state money, but interestingly enough, what you're telling us you still need got adjusted, not just down because you got more state money, but it got countered by the fact that you're also saying you have additional expenses of $4 million more in special education. That's the part that I thought I heard Ms. Koufax talking about, that they're going to say, so you got additional state revenue, which should have brought your ask down to us lower, but actually you're saying you've got these other expenses that have been updated and they went back up. So the delta of what you're still asking us is
back to numbers have been updated, but we're not changing the ask because that's the ask is what the school board approved. It's just unfortunate that the increase in enrollment costs came in the same year that we had additional state revenue.
Right.
Because we recalculate that enrollment cost every spring. Some years it goes in our favor. It goes down. Some years it doesn't work in our favor. One of the years we had an increase of $10 million that we had to absorb this time of the year.
But that's the homework that I'm talking about. They know it's easy to understand the answer if you got more money from the state. That's hallelujah for everybody, right? So they're not going to question that. But they are going to go, so how come that number didn't come down all the way? Oh, well, now you have an adjusted number, which is $4 million more for special education. That's the part that I'm saying. If we can show the recalculated math, we have a better chance for them to say, you didn't just wave the wand so you could hopefully get $4 million still coming out.
Well, we attempted to explain that, but we maybe need to do this again. The other thing,
it's easier for me to defend
maybe more
it.
specifics. I agree with you. The other thing we've got to be really careful about is the employee compensation incentive. That's not even funded yet. That's just if they. I mean, that's a real unknown, and I think there's a lot of danger in saying, oh, they're getting that 4.7 when we really don't know that we're going to get the 4.7. What happens if it's not funded? There we are left with another hole of 4.7, which that's not easy to find in our budgets these days.
Well, and so I would just say again, because everything's about how you present the information and then how it gets interpreted. So maybe that's not a line item that you want in your confirmed category right now. It's an asterisk below saying if the board, if
it was in the presentation to the board about, and then we can make
right
the
now
correction
today
here
it's differently, and I'm saying that's where Dr.
Okay.
Garza is correct. The other thing is about the $13 million. I do want to say that it is absolutely important. This is our job as elected leaders, that we're supposed to put our voice out publicly on something that's important. And so I think what you're all proposing, again, I would just say it's, thankfully Matt has joined us in communications and working with Dr. Garza's team. That needs to be very powerful, very clearly stated letter about the need and the expectation on that one. And I think everyone's correct. We need to fight for that.
Okay, good. I'm going to move us on here. Ms. Hines, Mr. Annette Koufax. I guess what first I'll do is to folks who haven't spoken yet. So Ms. Hines, Ms. Evans, and then Ms. Derenak-Kofek. Okay.
Okay. I don't know, just feeling the need to provide a little, I'm lost for words today. A little, anyway, perspective, thank you. On this whole question of, are we transparent enough? Are we talking about this in the right way? Have we tried every possible way to persuade our funders to do the right thing? And I feel like even in my 3 years on the board, we've tried everything. And we provide all kinds of information. We've tried all different ways of communicating. We've tried all different ways of working with other stakeholders in the community, fighting for ourselves, and not with the other stakeholders in the community. And when you look at this year, with the Board of Supervisors leaving themselves absolutely no flexibility in the tax rate, knowing that that would cause them to not fully fund us, and nobody apparently on the Board of Supervisors right? Which would have cost me $1 a week, okay, as a taxpayer. So here we are spending $1,000 less in real dollars than we were in 2008 per child. So if you think about that, 180,000 students, that's $180 million that we are short where we would be if we were back before the recession, right? So I don't see any effort. I just don't see it. I don't see the Board of Supervisors or our funders in the state making any effort to help turn this corner with us. And we can show you where that $180 million is. $50 million in class size increases right there. It's about $50 million roughly a year in compensation increases to get us back to where we should be regionally. And then we have the VRS challenges coming up. So you can find that $180 million easily without even looking at pre-K, technology, investments, ESOL program, right, all the innovative things that we want to do and should be able to do here in Fairfax County. So, of course, we have to always communicate and always do the best we can. But I honestly, I don't think we are responsible for the fact that we're not getting what we need this year. We made a bare bones offer. We were good partners, right? And this is what we got in return. So.
Yeah. Well, that quieted the room down. Okay, I've got a number of folks here. Miss Evans.
Yes, well, I will agree with the statements of some of my colleagues that our funders have sorely let us down and seem to be just ignoring our real needs, particularly as we have the growth in the high needs students, the ESOL students and our special needs students. And that's extremely unfortunate. I actually just have one question. You say that they have found a way to take care of their BPOL problem? And
they
that's
had
$30
funding
million?
previously set aside in the litigation reserve inside their insurance fund, so they have one-time funding set aside. That's not going to help them with ongoing requirements, but it may help them initially.
But that was one of the things that we kept hearing, that they had another $30 million added bill, and that was one of the reasons that they couldn't increase the funding for us. So I think that's
We're waiting for a budget question response back. Patty Reed had asked a question about BPOL funding, so we're waiting for that formal request back.
Okay.
But it does appear that they do have funding that they previously set aside of $30 million and an additional $15 from FY15 third quarter review.
Well, that's good to know. And lastly, they have said that that they are going to, as a county, get I believe it's $2.7 million more from the state than they were expecting. I just throw this out. In talking with Delegate Corey, she seemed to think it was substantially higher. Do we have any information about how much more the county will be getting?
Well, when I looked at the number statewide, the statewide number was approximately $30 million, very similar to what Delegate Corey thought. So she may be picking up the statewide number versus the county number.
Just thought it would be lovely if we had that number. All right, thank you.
That's like the old banker in your favor from the Monopoly game. Yes. Okay. Ms. Derenak-Kofek, you ready?
Yes, okay. I just have a brief question. More dollars on the English for speakers of other language.
Yes, we are working to get all of the enrollment projections calculated because our commitment was to get staffing to HR so they could start staffing meeting with principals on Monday, March 23rd. So I do expect us that week to have the calculated cost for enrollment growth sometime in that week.
But that would not include, remember we were doing the cross for my colleagues on the board. We were talking about programmatic changes to the ESOL program, perhaps a school within a school, whatever the staff's recommendation, that would not include monies funding for that.
No, at this point, we're just in the cost that I was referring to, trying to calculate the actual cost of enrollment growth. So that wouldn't take into account any new innovations or other services to students.
Do you have an idea when that might happen?
We are still working on that. we are working on that program.
Programming?
Yes.
Oh,
Well,
it's on the schedule to present to you
I know
all
in May,
but we know we're going to have to make it work within our current staffing.
Okay.
And just looking creatively at our current
right.
Okay.
staffing models.
That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Okay, Mrs. Strauss, for a quick go back.
Very quick, in explaining the sort of the staffing thing, I find that as part of we explain, to particularly the Board of Supervisors, they don't understand that the special ed is based on what we have now. It's not a fluffy projection. They don't understand how IEPs work. They don't understand the fact the amount of children with needs that can come to us throughout the year. And for very young children, it's 12 months of the year. And I don't think anybody has ever answered in enough detail, because that's over the weekend. We were all out going, no. But it is the understanding of children who are currently here. We've had to satisfy IEPs now and how that process works. So that's the kind of explanation that they need.
I think they also, the phenomenon of, and I tried to explain this in the slide, is what are the unknowns when the advertised budget's developed? Right? There are a lot of unknowns. And we're driven by the number of students and the services they need in the system, and that changes over time. In other county services, they just develop an amount of money. It's not driven necessarily about how many kids keep enrolling. And it's a very different phenomenon that they don't have to...
That's right. They don't have to buy more books for the library or hire more staff to process more library cards. But that's the difference that we need to explain, that by federal law, we must continue to serve children. So I think that's an important difference.
Okay, I'm going to take just a quick turn and say that it seems to me that we have tried just about every approach that we could come up with. So if anyone has any other ideas about what we might do, we do have some time yet before the public hearings, and we do have interested stakeholders. So I think the question becomes, what would be compelling? What would be different about the story that we're telling this year? And I'm hearing some of my colleagues say perhaps it's a more descriptive. Might be helpful, maybe to humanize it. I don't know, but it seems to me it's worth a try to figure out how we can assure them that this year is different. Because I think, again, a lot of people are just reverting back to, well, in the past, there was this perception, they just kind of made up some numbers, and there was fluff in the budget, and they always found money for a special project when they wanted to. And so, that's the history, and people don't forget those things. So even though we have a different approach, I think that's probably what's in the back of some people's minds. So it probably wouldn't hurt us to over-communicate in this particular case. And then if there are other ideas, I know in the budget meeting that we had last week at Providence, the citizens were being very creative about coming up with other options, like why can't they raise the BPOL taxes, the tax rates? That's something within their control. So, there may be some other things that are out there rather than them always saying, oh, there's nothing we can do, And they're in a bind. I think we all understand that as well, but... That's just the 2 cents that I wanted to say. I feel like when we say there's a needier population this year and our enrollment numbers are going up, somehow that's just falling on deaf ears. And I don't know what we do differently to try to get them to see. I believe they're seeing it on their side too in terms of the need for some social services and other services. But I don't think any of us are hearing, a great excitement about, giving us additional funds that we so dearly deserve. So any last comments? Otherwise, we'll go to next steps because we have identified something in particular, and that is a letter to the Board of Supervisors. I heard that it would request the $13.1 million. Mr. Moon, did you want to comment on that?
Let me speak on that. I might have understood Mrs. Smith wrong on this one, but regardless of what she might have said, my advocacy on that one is this: to communicate in our communication with the Board of Supervisors, maybe from chairman to chair to chair communication, reiterate the mutual agreement. There was a commitment. I mean, it has gone through what? How long was your work on the infra?
Too long.
About a year. Yeah, about a year's of work by two. I mean, it's a joint committee and fully ratified by both boards. And if you go back and read their recommendations adopted by both boards, it clearly states it's a per year, $13.1 million per year. It's not one-time funding, per year from FY 2016. I mean, I'm not going to accept anything less than that. I mean, whether they do it through additional debt service, out of their operating fund, that's what they need to do, is to provide us what they committed, what they promised. I mean, I don't expect anything less from our chair in her communication with their chair.
Mrs. Smith?
So I understand what Mr. Moon is saying. And I do support referencing that the expectation of our board was a long-term commitment, but I guess I'm also want to be focused on the short-term solution. And I know darn well we're not going to get this increase in the cash flow every year. What are the chances of getting the $13 million to the construction fund? So to me, it's a mixture of how do we take care of this and say, we're focused on this right now. I worry about expanding it too much. I mean, I don't have much faith we're going to get this taken care of anyway, but I feel a responsibility that we need to advocate for this because we built it on the expectation that we would receive those funds. So I'm kind of mixed with how much we push the long-term piece.
So I think we could also recommend in the letter, whatever funding option, because it could also be done through their one-time funding, because it's only really for 16, because they're going to build it into their 17 budget, right? Because they deferred it till 17, so they could use some one-time funding. That's another option for them to do as well.
Ms. Schultz, followed by Ms. Hines.
I love these days when Ms. Smith and I are right there. We're simpatico. So we have sometimes I think, our story is hampered by previous chapters in a book that some of us don't own. But there is such a clear and compelling case, for the short-term resolution to this problem, which is you committed to it. You committed to it, and whether you find a way, whether, the walnut shells cover, capital, whatever you want to call it. You want to call it renovation monies, you want to call it major, reconstruction, whatever you want to call it, or you want to go straight to the capital dollars and have it in a capital budget transfer, who cares? The $13.1 million is a compelling case because we have built this case and they know why we need it. I don't want to muddy a short-term solution with a long-term problem that has to be solved no matter what. We've got to solve today, but I don't want to sacrifice the solution of today and say we're going to give up on the long-term solution. It's a and, not an or, and it's not an and or. It's an and. But let's not lose focus. Let's be very strategic on get the 13.1 million solution handled correctly in a letter, correctly in, hello, Mr. Guilfoyle. Your name just came up for the first time. Welcome to FCPS communications outreach. In our public engagement, at a board level, at a division level, at a superintendent level, at an individual board member level, crafting the message is around both the short-term solution for right now and continuing to keep the eye on the horizon of that long-term strategic issue. But I don't want to muddy the waters, okay? Ms. Reed, that's my advocacy. Don't muddy the waters and have it be, an also-ran, because we're going to wind up losing potentially both.
Thank you. Ms. Hines?
Thank you. I'll try to be less angry this time. So on this one, I know, right? Thank you. This is my therapy. But on this letter, I don't know. Maybe it makes sense to kind of, because who are we talking to really? If we just send a letter to the Board of Supervisors, it's not going to have an effect, right? I mean, we're really sending a letter to the public, to the Board of Supervisors and the public, right? So to me, the message to the public should be, I think maybe kind of what Mrs. Schultz is talking about is, okay, you made a commitment of this $13.1 million. We understand that we might have to settle for, or we would be willing, because we're so nice that way. We would be willing to take it as, with the 1 point, on the other way, right? Which I'm not going to bother trying to describe. And then, do we do a press release with this? We certainly could, right? And we could attach a photograph to that press release of the trailer park out back of McNair Elementary School.
Right, and that. Exactly, yeah. And we have on the Public Engagement Committee, we've been talking about the budget communication strategy. How do we take some of these talking points and get these messages out? Who are the messengers? What are the messages? And what are the vehicles to do so? So I think we all agree there's a number of ways that we can and should articulate this particular issue. My one question is on the letter, are we just strictly focusing then on the 13.1 million? And what about some of this other discussion we've had about the change in enrollment and the change in the needs of the students, et cetera? Or is this letter strictly focusing on the 13.1 million? Yes. I'm seeing head nods. Yes. Okay. Just to clarify, just wanted to make sure.
Mrs. Smith's initial advocacy is the way I would intend to do that, and I would like just a general consensus from the board. Is this something people would support? Heads nodding, heads in agreement. Maybe not everyone.
Okay, all right. So we
I don't
have
know what we are agreeing to.
Well, we're talking about the general, the general
but
sense
basically
of the
look
letter.
at the next steps, because that's what we're talking about here. Oh, okay. I apologize. Okay, Ms. McLaughlin, and then we'll review, when you have a minute, review the next steps.
Okay, yeah. The go back I wanted, and I'm going to look at Mr. Velkoff when I say this. Tomorrow may be St. Patrick's Day, which, as Megan O'Brien McLaughlin, is certainly one of my favorites on the calendar. But as I've been gently encouraged by Mr. Velkoff and others that I am at my best when my social worker hat is on versus my Irish hat, I hope we will do this incrementally. I mean, I think we go with the letter first, and I look forward to our chair definitely collaborating as closely as possible with Chairman Bulova on this letter that we're about to talk about. And then if we don't get there, then we have to think about some other more aggressive moves like press releases and public admonishment. But I think incrementally going at them, and we've worked real hard as a board and with the superintendent to collaborate with them. And as frustrating as it is to have to do it this way, I think we'll be best served if we still approach them with a gentle hand and hope they shake it.
Okay, any other comments before next steps? Mr. Lateef.
Thank you. I'd like to agree with Ms. McLaughlin that we should definitely start out with a gentle hand, but we should always leave on the table the thought that, if more drastic steps are necessary, because looking at FY17 sort of looming above us, especially with the VRS increases that are mandated, if we can't cooperate now and if we can't get the increase that we need now, we're going to have a much, much tougher hill to climb next year. Thank you.
Yes. Said the wise sage. That's right. Okay, so next steps then, if everyone can read this, the board chairman to send a letter to the supervisors, or I guess it's more accurately to the chair of the board of supervisors, but to advocate that the county honor the agreement of the IFC to provide FCPS an additional $13.1 million in capital funding, issue a press release regarding the issue. So I guess just stop for now after capital funding. Unless, I didn't hear that that we would do a press release right out of the box, right? So, in terms of a next step, that's our basic next step. And then from there, we'll take subsequent steps, Mr. Stewart?
And this may be self-evident, but I would also ask specifically that the letter include and have them advise us when the funds would be available. So we're asking for really a specific response, not just we intend to do it, but some kind of definitive response about we would expect to do that now or it'll be a year from now. Or, again, we want on the table what it is they believe they will or won't do. And I realize until they actually approve it, it may not be something the chair can say, officially, but at least, or if nothing else, ask the chair when she will be bringing the matter to the board for their official vote. We're looking for a specific date or time that they will be doing something, and then can advising us with. So
so it's not open-ended.
Yes,
right. I have
exactly.
Ms. Strauss, Mr. Moon, quick
And
backs. We're going to wrap up.
I assume that at this point we're asking for increase in debt capacity. Isn't that what you all are at?
Mr. Moon.
However they do it, whether it's it's out of their year-end debt service.
We don't care how they do it.
However they do it, it doesn't matter to us as long as they deliver their commitment to us. And I was trying to respond to Mr. Stewart's request about knowing when. Don't they make those decisions as they approve the transfer, part of their transfer, they also act upon capital fund transfer to us?
Unless they decide to use one-time funding. So they may be approving their budget and maybe with some guidance that approved budget to say at year-end, available funding will be provided.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Evans, you get the last word.
Well, just a clarification, and maybe this is understood with this letter, but the Board of Supervisors wasn't just the agreement of the committee, that the Board of Supervisors also adopted that. So we need to,
Yeah, I think, yes, but yes, true. I think everyone agrees and acknowledges that, in fact, both boards did approve what the IFC had agreed upon. So, yes, okay, very good. And with that, this work session is adjourned. I suggest a 5-minute break, and then we'll start on governance just 1 hour and 10 minutes behind. We'll make the time.